All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your punctuality and for joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you are for this webinar. We're going to wait just a couple seconds while everybody in the waiting room can connect, and we'll get started. Okie dokie. Looks like we have everyone in. Sean, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Andres. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'm the CEO of Verite. Verite is an independent nonprofit organization advancing fair labor worldwide since 1996. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today focused on the mining sector, highlighting the responsible sourcing tools new toolkit for preventing and addressing human trafficking and the production of critical metals. We at Verite are particularly proud of all the open source resources we've been able to create and share since 2013 through a very close partnership we've enjoyed with the U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. The Responsible Sourcing Tool, which we call RST, represents the most sophisticated set of resources anywhere for fighting human trafficking in supply chains. They enable companies of all kinds, including federal contractors, to better prevent, identify, and address human trafficking in their global supply chains, and most importantly, to develop effective risk management systems. The RST website includes 11 key sectors and 49 commodities, most at risk for trafficking or trafficking-related activities. This month, we're launching 6 new commodity reports on critical metals, plus comprehensive sector analyses and complete due diligence toolsets for both the mining and transportation industries. In addition to these new tools, I wanted to remind you that the RST site also has comprehensive toolkits for the seafood, food and beverage, private security, facility services, and construction sectors. This webinar today is the first of a 3-part series in partnership with the U.S. Departments of State and Department of Transportation. I hope you will join us on September 16th for our webinar focused on the transportation sector. And on September 24th, we'll be having a practical training on how to conduct risk assessments in your supply chains for both of these sectors. In both the mining and transportation sectors, forced labor and other forms of exploitation can occur everywhere from the point of extraction of resources necessary for both industries, but also during the processing and refinement stage and further downstream in manufacturing and operations. Forced labor also occurs in the recruitment of workers for these jobs. And in the very large and diverse transportation context, the risks are in everything from the manufacturing of car parts to the staffing of cruise ships to the contracting of truck drivers. Both sectors are high-risk industries that require comprehensive due diligence, transparency, and collaboration to combat human trafficking and other labor violations, and the RST tools will help you figure out how to do that. The launch of the mining sector toolkit could not be more timely. The demand for critical minerals has increased dramatically over the years due to the demand for various advanced technologies, from semiconductors to batteries to electric vehicles. The U.S. government, through the Department of Homeland Security, recently named copper and lithium as new priority sectors for Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act enforcement. Finally, a big thanks to our team for developing these critical resources, which represent decades of Verite's collective experience supporting companies and government entities in responsible sourcing. We've built these tools with real-world input from companies and other stakeholders so that they address the concrete challenges you face daily. With that, I'd like to introduce our Verite presenters, our Senior Director, Michael Vaudrell, our Research Director, Ali Arbib, and supporting them is our another Senior Director, Lydia Long. Thank you, and over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Sean. Hi, everybody. So I'd like to start just with a brief agenda. I'll spend about 2 seconds on Verite, introduce the Responsible Sourcing Tools site. Then I'll hand it over to Ali to talk about the research findings for the mining sector. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion of the tool sets in the prevent part of the site, where we actually get into what companies can do about the risk. So Sean covered most of about Verite. All I wanted to say is, all of the tools and other information on the website is really based on the 30 years of work that Verite has done with multinationals and governments, and is, as Sean said, a collaborative effort with both the Department of State and the Department of Transportation. So the responsible sourcing tool .org, we've talked about this in previous webinars, but I want to talk about the updates that we've made to it. As Sean said, it is a website that provides tools and resources for both government agencies and private companies to help any organization understand the issues of forced labor and human trafficking, and to identify and address the risks in their operations and their supply chain. The QR code on the slide would take you directly to the site. Now, the site is set up in three pillars. The first is one that helps you understand the nature of forced labor, the scope of forced labor risk. So it's really a definition pillar. The identify pillar, through the use of visual maps, helps the user identify where forced labor risks are by industry, by commodity, and source country. And again, the information on this site comes from a number of different locations, such as the annual TIP report from the Department of State, from the Department of Labor lists of goods produced with forced child labor, and of course from Verite's research and field experience. And finally, the third pillar of the site, which I'll get into at the end of the presentation, is really a set of tools that helps any organization create a due diligence process to identify and address forced labor risks in their supply chain. This is a very quick overview of the understand risk pillar. It first describes risks related to the product or the commodity, how that particular product or commodity is produced, essentially what are the operational risks, and then what's the nature of the workforces present in that particular sector, the nature of the work that could present vulnerability to forced labor. Then it also gets into country risks. So risks associated with the country, such as rule of law, socioeconomic conditions, and then finally, labor. What country factors influence vulnerability to forced labor? Identify has a set of risk maps now that can help any organization understand how human trafficking is linked to where they operate, what they procure, and the commodity specific issues. So let's take a quick look at this and how you would get into it. Let's pick the extractive sector, and then and if once you do that, you get an industry profile pops up down below. If you select a specific commodity, in this case, you're able to look at the risk profile for that commodity. And then finally, you would then select a country. And if we select China, for example, you will get a list of all of the indicators of risk or of things that could indicate the potential risk for forced labor in that country. And we're going to, as Sean said, in the third webinar, really get into risk mapping and risk assessment, and that's where these risk indices are going to become very useful for any organization who is looking to map the risks in their procurement. So let's look at what we've done here in 2025. The project that we've been working on with State Department is really focused on refreshing the original mining sector research report that's been available for probably 10 years now, really looking into the latest research and and getting into minerals and metals that are of critical concern now. As Sean mentioned, there are 6 new commodity reports for critical metals. Those are highlighted here in green. You can see that's cobalt, aluminum, manganese, nickel, and quartz or polysilicon, which of course is of great interest for solar power. And you can find these commodity reports on the identity page by scrolling down to the commodity profile link. Now, the newest commodity reports aren't directly accessible yet from the map. We're working on that, and it'll be ready any day now. But they are available through the direct links on the site. So essentially, why did we choose the mining sector for the work in 2025? And looking at this table, it should be pretty obvious that the mining sector is huge. It's huge in terms of the number of industries and products that depend on mine mineral materials. So the impact is just very broad across basically all industry sectors, and the number of people either directly or indirectly employed in the sector and thereby potentially at risk of forced labor is also quite large. Um, we have a total of almost 4 million workers in the formal mining sector, another 45 million in artisanal and small scale mining, including, as it says, about 1 million children. And then, vastly more that are employed in businesses supporting artisanal and small scale mining, whether they're supplying transportation or processing or tools and other materials needed for ASM mining. In terms of the scale, ASM mining accounts for, as you can see, a significant percentage of gold, tantalum, and tin produced globally. So although these are, as the name implies, small operations, there are so many of them and so many people involved that the amount or the share of materials produced through ASM is quite large. What I'm going to do now is hand this over to Ali Arbib, who will go over some of the key research findings in the sector. Ali?
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, Sean. So as Michael said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research findings that Verite has put together through our own field work, through consultation with stakeholders, through desk research. And I'm going to start just where Michael left off, which is the scale of mining and the scale of forced labor in mining. So this is a picture of Michael showed the identify section of the responsible toolkit, and what we can see here, there's a lot of countries with forced labor, documented forced labor, and child labor in mining, and many of these countries are ranked really low when we're looking at indicators of human development, of poverty, and this is important because think many people in the social responsibility due diligence space are used to thinking about labor in terms of formal workplaces. So labor that happens in a factory, labor that happens in a specific work site. And when we're talking about mining, it's really critical that we're considering the broader holistic picture of what people's lives look like. And so that's going to be a theme that we're going to come back to again and again throughout the research. So many of these workers are already vulnerable before the exploitation of the mine begins. Many people involved in mining is the really only livelihood they have access to. So it's very easy with that level of vulnerability to become trapped in cycles of exploitation, of hazardous work, and death they can't escape. So we'll talk a little bit about So first, what is forced labor? When we're talking about forced labor, the simplest definition is a job that a worker can't freely agree to or could not freely agree to and cannot freely leave. So we can get a lot more technical than that, but if you have those two conditions, you can't fully and freely agree to the terms and conditions of the work, either because of there was deception at recruitment, because you were coerced into the job, and you can't freely leave it. You're unable to leave because of threats, intimidation, restricted freedom of movement, manipulation of debt, passport withholding. You have a situation of forced labor. So there's a lot of, that's what forced labor is. And that's the tip of the iceberg. Underlying that iceberg, there are a number of practices, conditions, and contextual factors that create these situations of forced labor, particularly. And so today we're going to be talking about what that looks like in the mining environment. One of the key points I want to make is, just as we're talking about holistic conditions, these factors don't exist alone. They reinforce each other. We're going to see them come up over and over again in the examples I'm going to talk about. So most victims are facing multiple factors simultaneously. Um, and as I said earlier, just really understanding the context of people's lives, where they live, community-based stakeholders, the role that mining plays in local communities, both positive and negative, is really critical for understanding what a responsible due diligence action plan looks like in a mining supply chain context. So just to really dip a toe into the depth of the research, we're going to focus on a few themes and examples that come up in looking at forced labor in a mining context. So we're going to be focusing on examples from around state-sponsored forced labor, illegal and or informal small scale and ASM or artisanal mining, the vulnerable populations that we often find in a mining context, mining that is controlled by or contributing to conflict or armed groups, and as well as the presence and the role of labor intermediaries and recruitment related debt. So we'll start with state-sponsored forced labor. So about 14% of global forced labor is labor that's imposed by governments. This can include state-owned enterprises that function like businesses, but they're controlled by the state, and they're very susceptible to corruption and forced labor practices. State-sponsored forced labor can be any labor that's used as a punishment, discipline, forced economic development, and so prison labor, coercive prison labor or forced prison labor, and labor transfer programs are included here. And so one of the critical things about understanding where specifically state-sponsored forced labor is present in mineral supply chains and mining supply chains is that there are implications for what types of due diligence are feasible in those contexts versus other types of forced labor in other contexts. So I think probably one of the most well-known examples of forced labor in mining, of state-sponsored forced labor in mining, comes from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, in China. So that's really the center of China's state-sponsored forced labor. It's often referred to as a labor transfer program, involves Uyghur and other ethnic minorities. It's often described as a vocational training or poverty alleviation program, but it is not voluntary. So the Chinese government has encouraged and invested in raw minerals mining in the region, and many of the mines are owned by these state-owned enterprises or subsidiaries. So sometimes understanding whether operation is state-owned or not can be challenging due to the number and sort of proliferation of subsidiary companies, but there's been a lot of research around documenting some of that ownership, and that research is provided in the mining sector report. This touches on a number of minerals: copper, gold, nickel, manganese, iron ore, titanium, lithium, magnesium, it's also been linked to the production of quartz, which is used to produce polysilicon, and there's been state-sponsored forced labor found in the production of polysilicon itself. So there's evidence that companies that mine and process quartz in this region participate in these labor transfer programs. There's been evidence of internment camps in the area, So this is just something to be critical. It's not limited to China and to this region. There's examples from Myanmar, from North Korea. So this is a really high risk and sort of particular case of forced labor and mineral supply chain. So another sort of theme or type of risk that comes up again and again is around informal and or illegal mining. This is so you might have, I'm sure you've heard the terms artisanal or ASM mining, small scale mining. So there's no single definition of this. It's essentially less technological mining that uses less technology, is less capital intensive. And because of those things, it's more labor intensive. So there's a lot of people. This can be families or individuals, all the way up to actual commercial operations that are just smaller scale. They're not these huge commercial concessions you might see. Often, informal and illegal are conflated in this context. So they're sort of used synonymously. They're not actually synonymous. So some small scale mining, much of it is illegal, but some of it isn't. Sometimes the miners have permits or following laws. So it's just good to be aware of the nuances there. It often occurs near large scale mining concessions where multinational mining companies are operating just because of the way that the minerals are distributed. There's estimates, I think Michael referred to it, there's estimates as many as 45 million people are involved in artisanal and small scale mining. So this is huge. It often gets talked about in terms of the negatives, but it's important to remember that this provides a livelihood for a huge number of people who otherwise may not have a livelihood. It produces a large supply of the world's gold, tantalum, tin, as well as gemstones. That said, in spite of that, the sort of, we think about the livelihood it provides, there's also a number of risks. So it's often outside and excluded from legal protections. There's no or typically, not always, but typically a lack of regular monitoring. It often happens in areas where there's weak governmental oversight. And so we see things like high rates of occupational illness and injury. There's rarely anything like PPE provided or benefits to workers. When accidents do occur, there's almost no mechanism for compensation. This is something that I worked with some researchers in Burkina Faso once, and one of my researchers was telling me about his childhood friend who was mining gold in Burkina Faso to put himself and his siblings through, he wanted to save for college. He was also trying to pay his siblings high school fees, secondary school fees, and he fell and he broke his legs, and that was it. He was not able to work anymore. He was disabled. They had no way to recover that money. So that's the type of things that can happen, particularly in dangerous work. In informal and illegal mining, also, many of the themes that we'll talk about today also are related. So the presence of middlemen or sponsors who are providing credit and loans to help miners purchase materials, which can create cycles of debt. We see a high incidence of marginalized and vulnerable populations like migrants, women, and children. I think I won't spend a lot of time on it for in the interest of time, but I think a lot of people are familiar with the examples of small scale mining in DRC, the use of children being exploited in forced labor in these contexts. There's also sex trafficking associated around where you have huge populations coming into one area, right? Like huge populations where there's not necessarily an infrastructure, often outside of government oversight. So things like sex trafficking and other forms of exploitation have been associated, which is different than exploitation in the mines. But when you have massive influx of people into an area, we can see challenges like this. And just because it's happening in informal sites, gemstones, metals, easy to smuggle. So when there's not really strong controls, they can often be untraced and entering formal supply chains. So we'll talk a little bit more now about the vulnerable populations. So I think I've already talked about the economic desperation we see. So mining is something where people who are landless lack alternatives for other forms of livelihood, often in areas where there's already been a lot of environmental degradation and traditional livelihoods like agriculture are no longer available, mining becomes essentially the only viable income source, despite its dangers. This is not because of the dangers of doing this work. It's often not a job that people are wanting to take on if they have other opportunities. So we see socially marginalized groups, any group that faces discrimination in formal employment, whether that's barriers to education that's needed, whether that's discrimination in hiring processes, whether that's just a lack of opportunity, they're pushed towards often the more unregulated mining work. The other thing about mining, if you think about where mines are located, and this varies, this can depend wildly, really depending on the context, but in a lot of cases, they're isolated mining sites. So they're often outside areas that are somewhat outside government control altogether. Sometimes it just means that they're outside any sort of labor inspector oversight. Once people are on site at a mine, depending on where it's located, it can be really hard to escape. There's often just a lack of transportation or communication in the area. So people are just inherently isolated by the nature of where the mines are located. So someone may be prevented from leaving just because of the nature of the isolation, and bad actors can take advantage of that. We do see a lot of children, particularly in ASM and small scale mining. In many cases, entire families will be engaged in this mining. And so children will be working alongside their families as a way to supplement family income. In some cases, they're used to perform tasks that adults can't perform. They're sent down narrow mine shafts. They're handling toxic mercury and gold processing. And because mining is often so all-consuming, children will abandon education and other opportunities. So really, when we see children involved in mining, this is typically even if it doesn't rise to the level of forced labor, this is the worst forms of child labor because it's preventing them from the rights of childhood, like a right to education. We see a lot of migrant workers. So again, people who lack social support, legal protections, being excluded from other forms of formal work can make migrants more likely to accept dangerous conditions. And then once they're on site, particularly if there's a fear of retribution, so a worker who is not in a country legally may, there are conditions there that can make them more easily to control, right? They feel they have no right to complain. They have no way to express a grievance without fear of retribution. In some cases around mines, there might be housing provided by a mine owner or another party who controls the mines. That can sometimes be the cost of that housing or of essentially company stores around mining sites can be exorbitantly high, which can lock people into cycles of debt. It's also important to talk about women. Again, particularly around artisanal and small scale mining, it's very dangerous. They're less likely to be involved in like mine shaft work and formal mine employment, but things like cleaning of minerals around mine sites, as well as unpaid labor like cooking, and that mineral cleaning can be very hazardous. There's often chemical exposure there. There's also, as I discussed earlier, there can be sex trafficking around these sites. There's a lot of documented sexual assault, discrimination, harassment that happens. So it's really good to be aware of the presence of women in mining and the specific risks that they face. One example of a vulnerable population in mining and the way that they can be particularly oppressed is looking at the Dalit group in India. So you look at conditions of poverty, landlessness, really discriminated against in terms of employment in an organized or formal sector. So they're recruited by quarry owners. They're to come work in silica quarries. They are provided with high interest loans or advances just for basic expenses. And then once they take these loans on, they're really not able to repay them with the earnings they're making at the mines. So they create these debt cycles. While they're working, they're inhaling silica dust, these like micro silica dust particles, which causes lung diseases like silicosis, which is horrific, for lack of a better word. It's incurable. It can be fatal. People with it are not able to breathe, they died, they return home, the debt still exists. The worker has died, the debt still exists. So relatives or their children take on the debt, move to the mine site, start working, take on more loans, take on more advances, work harder, more silicosis. There's just cycles of intergenerational debt and disease from these types of arrangements. Another theme that we see coming up in the research is mining that is in some way tied to conflict. So it's either benefiting parties to a conflict, or it's controlled by violent and armed groups around mine sites. So it's linked with armed conflicts all around the world. We do see examples of armed militias or other violent combatant groups forcing workers to work in mines. And so there's a number of reasons why this sort of association exists. So minerals obviously provide revenue streams. They're able to be smuggled. They can be, when there's not due diligence and trace, they can be essentially untraceable. In Colombia, for example, gold mining revenue, I think I've seen numbers that it exceeds cocaine revenue for armed groups. So it's a really important source of revenue to fund these groups, to fund conflicts. Many of the mine sites, as we've talked about, outside areas of government control. So these armed groups can establish controls and they can take over. And then with that control of extraction point, it allows them to essentially like tax or extort money from all of the players in that supply chain. So in these cases, we sometimes see trafficking into an area. So there's an example in Mali where there's criminal trafficking, essentially gangs or armed combatant groups, anti-government groups who control mining, gold mining in areas outside government control, especially in the north of Mali. So you see Mali is a country where there's a lot of poverty. There's also surrounded by other countries where there's been a lot of unrest and displaced people. So these traffickers are luring people from Mali, but also from neighboring countries like Nigeria and Senegal. They're promising them jobs and transport to Europe. So people coming don't believe that they don't understand that they will be in Mali at all. That's not what they're coming for. But once they have been lured, they often pay fees, travel fees to Europe, but they're essentially trafficked then to work in these gold mines in Mali. They create additional debts once they're on site. And so, we can see how these cycles can perpetuate. In addition to trafficking people in from outside the area, once an armed group is in control in a region, any local population, often there's cases where local populations have been participating in artisanal small-scale mining for generations. An armed group comes in and essentially starts to extort money from those miners. And they're armed. They can perpetrate human rights atrocities, including murder, rape, torture on site. So there's absolutely an environment of fear and intimidation. And then the revenue they generate funds their continued operations. So there's a self-perpetuating cycle. All right, and for our final sort of theme example, I'll talk, and this I think is something that as you have noticed has come up repeatedly, this theme of labor intermediaries and recruitment linked debt in mining. The same dynamics that we've talked about in India and other places, miners borrow money or they take advances from intermediaries. These are recruiters. In the India example, they were taking the money directly from the quarry owners themselves. Here we're talking about labor intermediaries taking advances from recruiters who are selling them on promises of high pay, good conditions, the ability essentially to strike it rich, right? We've heard that in gold rushes all over the world, all throughout history. The ability to strike it rich can be really, it can be a source of a lot of hope for people that don't have other livelihoods. Of course, people aren't able to repay their debt. What they're earning is not nearly enough to repay their debt. But they're on site, they're at this mine, now they're in the presence of coercive control or violence. Then they often have to take on more debt just to survive or to support their families at home. And we can see the cycles continue. In ASM in particular, there's often a sponsor system where even though artisanal small scale debt is relatively limited in terms of the capital and technology that's needed, people do have some equipment needs often. And so there will be sponsors that provide the equipment or money to buy the equipment, often in exchange for a percentage of the mining, whatever ore or stones are mined as repayment. Um, and this really leaves people in a place where they're never going to be able to earn enough cash to fully pay off these debts. So they continue taking on loan for living expenses. And then they're just compelled to keep working continuously. Um, there are other tactics that are used. So, for example, in addition to the sponsor system for equipment, um, people from recruiters may receive advances of money, clothing, transport as gifts. They may be presented as gifts up front. And then once someone is on site, actually not a gift, it's a loan. Um, and again, thinking about the fact that these mining sites are often really highly physically isolated. So once people are on site, they may have no way to be in contact with friends or family or other individuals who could help them. One example that we've seen that a colleague came across in Peru around gold mining was domestic workers being recruited through intermediaries in their hometown. So they're given these gifts. They don't know how much. They just have no concept that they'll have to pay these gifts back. And then they're told that they have to, once they're on site, they're told they have to work for 3 months before leaving. They have it's really isolated in the mountains, no forms of communicating. In some cases, workers were sold by their family members who received these gifts. So if the family member received the gift and essentially exchanged a family member for the gift. So this can impact a lot of people. There can also be sex trafficking around these mines as well, with the use of recruiters and intermediaries. A final example I'll give you of the sort of case study of the role of labor intermediaries was around nickel production in Indonesia. So on the island of Sulawesi, there were Chinese migrant workers who were hired by subcontractors to work in nickel processing in Chinese-owned industrial parks, which were sort of built by the Chinese government under the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, and these facilities were developed to refine nickel ore. There were over 6,000 Chinese workers employed in these parks and facilities. They were recruited from their homes in China, multiple layers of labor recruiters, subcontractors, all the way down to a very local village level. And they were absolutely deceived about the type of work, what they'd be doing. They were not provided contracts. And then once they were on site, their passports were withheld. Wage deductions coming out of their wages was just another way to create debt for things like being a few minutes late, just displeasing a supervisor, huge, big portions of their wages taken out. They were subjected to physical and verbal abuse. They were required to have permits that they couldn't actually obtain to travel to the nearest town. They were required to work for longer than initially told. They were not able to return to China. And so that they entered into that situation, but the entry into that situation started with a labor recruiter in their hometown. So I hope that just gave you a taste of the sorts of themes that we documented through our research and presented in the mining sector research report. And now that I've talked to you about the risks, I'll pass it back off to Michael to talk a little bit more about what we can do.
Great, thanks, Ali. Fantastic summary. I wanted to let everyone know or remind you that we're going to be taking questions at the end. So if there are any questions that you have in your mind on what Ali just presented or what I previously presented or will be presenting, please just click the Q&A button on your Zoom menu bar and type in those questions, and then we'll get to those at the end. Okay, great. All right, so a lot of problems, obviously. So what can an organization who depends on mined metals and other materials, what exactly can you do? And so that brings us to the prevent pillar of the responsible sourcing tool. And the the prevent pillar contains the tool set that we've created to help government procurement for companies that are either buying or selling products to really understand what's needed and to put together a supply chain due diligence system or due diligence program, or who simply need ways to implement programs that they've already put together. So when you go um, to the prevent page, the main page, you get this diagram. And what this diagram illustrates are the 12 tools that are in the due diligence toolkit. Now, they're aligned with the OECD, they're aligned with other forms of due diligence guidance. It's not complete when you think about, well, how do we define or set up executive level or board level oversight of a program, or how do we report our findings publicly at the end of the year? That we don't have absolutely every single bit of the due diligence process or system in this tool set, but what we're focused on are what are the essential processes that you need to have in order to identify and address forced labor risks in your supply chains. So there's a quick list of the 12 tools that broken into the identify and address elements of due diligence. Tool 1 is kind of the overarching tool. It's an overview of a supply chain due diligence program, and I'll get into that in a little bit more in a few minutes here. Tool 2 is the sample code of conduct. So what are the requirements that you have of your suppliers that would be put in your contracts, would be put into other communications so that suppliers know what the expectations are. Tool 3 takes those code of conduct requirements and fleshes them out a little bit more. It really defines them as performance benchmarks, audit criteria, those things that you would use to evaluate how well your suppliers are meeting your code of conduct requirements. Tool 4 is still part of the assess. It helps an organization understand what the legal requirements are, how to find out what the legal requirements and other issues around the country level concerns are when doing a risk assessment and a prioritization of your supply chain. Tool 5 is very simply, what would you want your supplier to formally agree to in terms of their alignment with your code of conduct. Tool 6 is something that we're going to get into in the third webinar on September 24th, which is how do you map your supply chain, trace materials back to the source, and really get to the point where you have your supply chain prioritized by risk to know what to do next. Where are you going to go and do deep dive assessments or do other due diligence activities? And again, we'll get into that on the 24th. Tool 7 is for organizations that use recruitment agents, staffing agents, and others that are involved in managing all or part of your process for recruiting and hiring workers. How do you identify ones that have the ability to meet your requirements, to recruit ethically, to prevent forced labor issues in the recruitment and hiring of workers? Tool 8 is a tool, and we'll get into that in a little bit also today, is how do you do a quick desk level evaluation of a supplier's ability to manage forced labor risks in their operations and in their own supply chains. Tool 9 goes along with Tool 7, which is how do you monitor the performance? How do you know that a labor provider, once you've brought them on board, is continuing to operate in a way that is in compliance both with legal requirements and is also meeting your own human rights and its code of conduct expectations. Tool 10 is an important tool for doing any monitoring of suppliers, and that is engaging with workers to understand how the recruitment process worked for them, how workplace practices align with their expectations and respect their rights. And finally, Tool 11 is kind of a form of stakeholder engagement and essentially focuses on workers. How do you proactively involve them to get continual feedback on the suitability of workplace practices and programs? And then how do you set up an effective grievance mechanism so that workers can, if there are, or if they do believe there are violations of their rights, how can they report and have those remediated to their satisfaction? And finally, for organizations that are government contractors and need to put in place a compliance plan for the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR, how would you go about doing that? So looking a little bit more at Tool 1, this is just a flow chart that accompanies the tool. The tool itself, if you open it up, it's written from the perspective of an organization who is creating a due diligence program. So this is essentially our program. This is how we perform due diligence of our supply chain. And the main elements of the program are the scope and objectives of due diligence. Why is the company doing it? Who is accountable for it? Who's responsible for implementing it? How does a company perform mapping? What is required for a supplier to become a supplier to the organization? What's involved in contracting? What kind of screening? Are there any criteria where a supplier would be rejected as a supplier for the organization? Then how do you prioritize suppliers for further work, for doing an audit, for some more in-depth level of due diligence? Once you have suppliers on board, then the tool gets into describing how they would do continual monitoring of the performance of their suppliers, including their labor suppliers, services suppliers, anybody providing goods or services to the company. And then finally, how would you respond to issues? What if you actually did find a case of an individual in forced labor? What if there are significant violations of your code of conduct? What do you do? And that's all illustrated very briefly in this flow chart. You can see here the main steps of a supply chain due diligence process are listed, and how each of the tools in the toolkit support those processes. So, it starts with communicating your expectations to suppliers. Well, that's where the tool 2 for the code, and tool 3, the benchmarks, all of those come into play. And that goes through the entire process here, from after communicating expectations to mapping your supply chain, performing risk assessments, and monitoring supplier performance. Each of the tools supporting those elements is described. Flipping over to Tool 8. Tool 8 is, as I mentioned, a way to screen suppliers before you've decided to bring them on board. What are the criteria for a prospective supplier actually being engaged by the company? And there's a set of questions that are broken. It's in 3 parts. It looks at how the supplier goes about recruiting and hiring workers, how or and whether they use and how they use staffing and recruitment agents, and finally, how would they manage? What are the practices for managing migrant workers that may be on their payroll, including what kind of housing is provided for those workers? So there are questions in each of these three parts, and then the tool also has at the end of it interpretive guidance. So if a supplier answers a certain way, it will tell you whether that answer represents an at-risk practice or whether it's in conformance with both legal requirements and your expectations. So a very useful tool that can also be used for periodically going back and doing a desktop review of supplier performance. The last tool I wanted to mention a little bit is the Interviewing Migrant Workers tool, Tool 10. And in doing assessments of a supplier, doing an audit, whatever you like to call it, you can certainly get information from reviewing documents. You'll get information from interviewing managers and supervisors. But in order to verify that what you're seeing, what you're reading, what you're hearing from management is in fact taking place, is to verify that with worker interviews. It's an essential part of the process. It's essential to verify that corrective actions have been taken. It's essential to verify the remediation, if remediation was necessary, for example, to pay back recruitment fees or to return identity documents, that remediation was effective and appropriate. And just that all of the standard work practices and procedures that the employer is using are effective in controlling risk. The best way to determine that is to talk to the people affected by workplace practices, to talk to the workers. So this tool gets into explaining how to do all of that in a very confidential, respectful way. It provides sample questions that cover a variety of the ILO indicators of forced labor. In fact, I believe that there are about 10 different sections in this tool. It's a rather lengthy tool. It's about 25 or 30 pages long. And for each of the questions, it provides common red flags. So what if the worker answers this way? What does that potentially indicate about the existence of forced labor issues in that operation? That concludes my part of the presentation. And what we're going to do at this point is begin the Q&A. And I want to turn this over to Lydia Long, who has been looking at the questions that are coming in chat, and we'll be directing those to the rest of us here.
Thank you, Michael. So we've had a question, a quick one for Ali on, maybe not so quick, but we only have 10 minutes, on how sort of the resources that we use for updating the RST, and what our updating process is. And sort of related to that is how we chose the countries and the various subsectors for drilling in on the mining industry.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you to whoever posed it. And so I'll try to keep it brief. So I'm a research person, so I could talk about this all day. But the short answer is that we update the reports, and we've been updating the commodity reports on an ongoing basis. So they use a really wide variety of sources. And we have a review process that includes looking for authoritative sources that provide some documentation of the existence. What we're looking for is not something that just claims that there is forced labor or human trafficking in a sector, but we're looking for authoritative documentation of the indicators of forced labor using international frameworks. So lack of consent to enter work, work that's not freely chosen, or evidence that there are a menace of penalty or something preventing workers from leaving. And so within that, we look at sources that can be from media, from NGO, from academic. As I referred to a few times, there's Verity's own field research working with researchers on the ground in some of these sites, which is really critical for helping us understand the complicated dynamics. And so looking at those sources on a continuous basis, updating the commodity reports. In the next year, I think I think 9 of the commodity reports will be updated.
Procure the sector
sources.
reports.
And the sector reports, which is really exciting. It's a
sector
huge
reports.
undertaking. So these are really extensive, fully cited reports that sort of sum up that broad picture of the documentation available. That said, and I talk about this in a number of contexts, I think it's really important to remember that the overlap of risk and what has been researched doesn't overlap fully. So risk and risks of forced labor and human trafficking can exist in context where it really hasn't been documented yet for a variety of reasons, whether it's often because research is really hard to conduct on the ground, really challenging for civil society to conduct research to get their message out. So often in the hardest, riskiest environments, it's hardest to conduct research and get information out. So that can sometimes mean that there is a lot of documentation about risk in places where it's easier to conduct research. So that doesn't mean that information isn't valuable. It's just really critical for us as we're sort of doing these global scoping exercises of what documentation of risks exists where, to know that sometimes, or often, an absence of information doesn't equal an absence of risk.
Great, and we have one for Michael that sort of asks around how do you conduct an audit at an artisanal mine, and more specifically, how do you inspire workers to answer honestly, and whether using local questioners or auditors can reduce the chances of corruption.
Wow, and it's a great question, and it's one that does not have a simple answer, unfortunately. Many artisanal mines, of course, are illegal operations. Ali talked about ones that may be owned or managed by gangs or armed groups, and obviously doing an audit of that kind of an operation would be difficult, if not impossible. We, in fact, have had one of our own staff members shot at that kind of an operation some years ago. Another thing is that you typically don't have just one artisanal mine in an area. There's usually a web of these things that may be all artisanal mines, or they may be around the perimeter of a larger scale, more formal mine. So traditional audit techniques don't work. The best way probably to do an audit of an artisanal mine is to begin with some kind of a risk appraisal of the entire area. Going in and working with community leaders, with NGOs who may be active in the area, talking to workers in the community to really understand what is taking place there, whether we're talking about just in informal mining, whether they are legal but small mines, or whether in fact we also have some that are illegal and are operated by armed groups. So starting out with that level of stakeholder engagement, really identifying what's going on is the first step, and then it's not an audit where somebody walks in and hands your business card to the site manager. Something would have to be put together that would probably involve the use of community groups or NGOs to piece together information about exactly what's going on in the operation through their personal knowledge of the area, of their ability to meet workers where they live and get more information. And then there may be, depending on how formal or informal the mine is, getting to talk to management or to the operators of the mine. But beyond that, it's everyone is kind of a unique case, and it's hard to come up with a formula for doing an ASM audit.
So there have been all sorts of fantastic questions, all of them requiring much more time than we have. In fact, we are at time now. So I think we're going to need to close, unfortunately, without getting into all of that. But we have a number of these topics are going to be touched on again next week on the for the second in the series, and then on the technical webinar on the 24th, as we're going to get into the really tricky processes for risk mapping, traceability, risk assessment, which some of the questions also got to as well. But I think we can only pitch to that now because we've run out of time to speak to them. So this is a thanks to everybody, and you're all going to be getting a follow-up email that'll link you to the recording. And thanks to Ali and to Sean and to Michael. Yes, use for whoever's still on, use the QR code to give us send us along any more questions and feedback, and also to get into the site and start to explore, which we're continuing to add to even as we speak.